Welcome to the Brie Pod. I'm here with Katie Bergtold, holistic health coach and entrepreneur, and she's been here before. So, hi, Katie.
Hi, I'm so excited to be back. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, thank you so much for joining me. I thought, what better way than to bring you back to discuss identity crisis, like the crisis of an identity. So, what do you? Let's just dive in. Um, how would you define an identity crisis?
Yeah, I know it's so different than what we talked about last time I was here. I think we were talking about some nutrition stuff last time.
Yes.
But you and I started talking about this recently because it's something I think that we've both maybe experienced in different ways. But I would say an identity crisis is when you're feeling confusion about your role or your purpose in life. And though it's not always the case, I would say it often comes up during times of great change or transitions in life.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to define it. And I think it's even better to bring you on here because, when we were conversing back and forth, I feel like it was such a pivotal moment to notice, even though, we had talked about how our paths are a bit different, but to have that same almost like level of an identity crisis in its general sense. Um, to know that, okay, well, if we're feeling this, who else is feeling it? And of course, on the Brie Pod, we have to cover something like this. So, um, I'm very happy that you're here to help discuss it out loud.
Yeah, no, it really is my pleasure. And I think that conversation helped me so much because I realized that it was something you had been through. And then I sort of started connecting the dots that other friends of mine had been through it in other ways too. And it definitely made me feel less alone to realize that I'm not the only one that bumps up against this.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like it's always a discussion where they'll say, there's a midlife crisis that happens, or sometimes people will joke about a quarter life crisis, but I don't think that they cover on identity crisis. And even though it's maybe not that exact term, but I think it's the best way to describe what you're feeling when a big change happens.
Mhm.
Um, that it is something that happens actually more often than not.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think you're right that we often hear it in regards to, the midlife crisis or the quarter life crisis or something like that. But absolutely, it can come up in so many forms and so many ways throughout our lives.
Yeah. And because it does, I think that we should definitely cover some of those things. So I want to start with let's talk about an identity crisis in career and maybe you could share a bit or shed light on, if you've been in that position and what you've done with that.
Absolutely. Many times in many ways. I actually would love to give a couple examples if that's okay, because I
Yeah,
have
absolutely.
great. So, I was at a job in my early to mid 20s. It was in the field of psychology. It sort of blended psychology and tutoring is the simplest way I can put it without going into that for an hour. That could be its own podcast. But, so much of my identity really was tied to that job. Really, all my good friends at the time were coworkers from that job. All the major mentors in my life and people that I looked up to and respected were my bosses at that job. So my identity was highly tied to that position. And while I loved that position and while it taught me so much, really so much that I'll carry with me for the rest of my life that I'm deeply grateful for, I hit a point where something just felt off and I knew it wasn't right for me anymore. And it was so hard and so scary to transition out of that role for all the reasons I just mentioned. All my friends were associated with this role. I had spent the past 6 years of my life, not to mention my entire college career, my 4 year college career, preparing for this role. And that was hard to leave behind too, because really
Yeah.
my identity from high school all the way up until that point was pretty tied into all of that. So, it was really scary to take that leap and to consider, what am I leaving behind, and to really reflect on the pain that could be associated with that.
Yeah.
Not to mention the fear of the unknown. And if I do leave this, what's
It's
next for me? So yeah, it was a really challenging time in my life.
yeah. I I am so grateful that you're able to share this with us because I just don't think that it's talked about a lot. I know that we feel it and I know that our bodies express it however it is, whether it's stress, anxiety, or even there's that feeling of freeze mode where you're like, I don't even know if I want to take the next step. Like, am I good enough? There's that whole
Yeah.
like mental process that comes from it as well. Can you uh share a bit on that? Like how were you feeling mentally with that change that was
Yeah.
going to happen?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The simplest answer is a lot of anxiety, honestly. And a lot of it was, the fear again of almost the repercussions of what's going to happen if I leave this job that I've put so much time and energy into. But then also, realistically, what's next for me? Is this a quote unquote smart move, which that gets into, I think, a lot of societal expectations on what a career is supposed to look like. And so yeah, I mean, I would say even, within my own family, I'm lucky that my parents always supported me and really were coming from a foundation always of do what's right for you. But I could tell even they were a little hesitant, like, oh, you're really stepping away from this thing that you invested all your time in college and that you've been at for the last 6 years. So it was hard. It was hard to have those conversations, with my bosses at that job, with my coworkers, with my family. It did produce a lot of anxiety for me for a while. The next step and what that was going to be produced some anxiety. So, yeah, mentally it was very taxing.
Yeah, absolutely. I could see how that, I mean, even just thinking with similar experiences in the career realm, like I feel like there is that culture of you stay with a job for like 30 to 40 years, you get, your social security, all these things that you look for, but it feels like there are times where our lives do pivot and because it seems I'm not saying all generations, but previous generations did stick with one thing for a long time. I don't feel like they couldn't give the advice on the new paths that many of us take nowadays, where we are more fluid, I think, with work and changing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think more fluid is exactly the way to describe it. And the reasons you're just stating are why my parents were probably pretty nervous too, right? They came from a generation where like it just looked a little bit different. Um, but yeah, I ultimately all I can say is it's so worthwhile to be with the discomfort of that for a period of time, especially when there's something in you that knows that the next step is something different or that where you're at just isn't right. There's so much value in writing out that discomfort as you get to the next step. Because I will say personally, I think the pain is greater to stay somewhere you shouldn't be,
Absolutely.
right, than to be with the short-term discomfort that leads into that next step. Now, on the flip side, if I can give you my second example, this is a little,
Absolutely.
I think sometimes it's almost fun to play with identity a little bit too. So the best example I can give of that would be after I left that job, I ended up going on to get my master's degree in nutrition, which was a little bit of a pivot from psychology, which I
Yeah.
had done in undergrad. And then shortly after I graduated with my master's degree, I was offered a position teaching as adjunct faculty at Portland Community College in Oregon, which I accepted. That was a really different experience with identity because that was a situation where yes, I had experience tutoring in the past. So, in a sense, I had some experience in the field of education. And I had never taught a college course. I had never put curriculum together. I had never taught adult students, right? So, I really struggled with identity in that sense because I felt like an imposter walking into
Yeah.
that job, quite frankly. I felt like I did not have the identity of someone who could teach at the college level. That did not feel like my identity. That did not feel true to me. That felt extremely uncomfortable to me.
Yeah.
And slowly I leaned in. I leaned into the discomfort. I wanted to run. I really did. I remember after the first or second class I ever taught, I was sitting there thinking, I need to email and quit. I can't do this. I cannot do this. I was so scared. but I leaned in. I just took one action at a time. I taught once a week at that point. So I focused on the next class, what I needed to do to prepare for that next class and not beyond that. I learned and asked for help when I didn't know what to do because I didn't always. I was putting together lectures, I was putting together assignments, quizzes, tests, you name it. But the cool thing is that the more I leaned in and the more I just took that next step, the more it did become my identity. And then by the time I was done with that first year, going into my second year, I felt like a teacher. I felt like it was part of
Beautiful.
my identity. So there is this aspect too, I think that is almost kind of fun in a way where if you can lean into that discomfort of a new identity, sometimes what's on the other side is really great.
Yeah, I'm actually happy that you brought that up because it is something that we put so much pressure on ourselves where we feel like we have to be this one way and that, if we go outside of it, that it's not gonna be safe or we're not gonna be okay. But I think that it really is important to know how it's okay if it's changing. Like change is scary, but it's okay that it changes too.
Yes, absolutely. And sometimes honestly it needs to change to get us where we really want to go in life.
Yeah. I mean, you definitely don't want to be sitting still in something that's not good for your health or like one thing I know from experience and with talking to family members, like they were making really good money in certain jobs and they felt that they needed that money. But I was always asking them, like, well, what about your mental health though? What about you? And when you get home and you feel overwhelmed and bogged down and you don't have like that passion anymore. I think like when you lose the passion, it's almost like maybe you do need to lean in a little bit on either shifting the course or going for something that, is the newer interest now. I don't know how to say that properly, but what I mean is like our interests can change too.
Absolutely. No, I think the way you said it was great. And yeah, that's exactly it. I think you have to be willing to lean into the discomfort of it and to understand too, to your point, sometimes it is scary to leave the job when you have financial security. And, obviously there's benefits to that too. But I think that sometimes it's overwhelming because we think we almost need to be this transformed person overnight to take the next step when really that happens. I think leaning in slower, gradual steps, like I did with the teaching, right? I didn't
Yeah.
just sit down and create this whole course and feel confident in a day. I really had to lean in moment to moment in whatever task I was completing in the moment, whether it was creating things or whether it was my actual hours spent teaching in front of my class. But, slowly over time, because I leaned in and just really focused on the next right step, then gradually that did become my identity and it became really natural and really great.
Yeah, and I think it helps like form a stronger confidence in you as well, because before you're thinking when you're in the crisis mode of like, I'm I'm not good enough. How am I gonna be, better or, all the thoughts that are
Yeah.
not so great. And then you look back and you're like, I did it. And I'm a teacher, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm so glad you said that because that's so important. I think we lose sight of that and we forget to take those moments to really reflect and look at how far we've come and to celebrate those moments because that's important too.
Yeah, we definitely do a lot. And when I say we, I do feel like it is a group feeling where we tend to focus solely on what we didn't do right, what we didn't say, or what we didn't. It's all like the negative side, but we never look at like what did we do right that was beautiful? We took that step that was scary, or even just the thought of taking the step is a huge deal. So we really
Absolutely.
have to look at that too.
Yeah, it's so true. It's so true. I learned this recently. Our brains have something called negativity bias. where your brain is essentially wired to focus on what goes wrong instead of what goes right or well, which sounds weird, but if you think about it, it makes sense because your body's trying to keep you safe. So if you
Yeah.
remember the bad things that happened, then, the idea is that maybe you'll be able to avoid those bad things from happening that make you unsafe in the future. But yeah, I mean, we're kind of oriented that way naturally to focus on the negative. So really leaning into the positive, I think too, and taking those moments to celebrate and looking at how far we've come are so important.
Yes. Also, I'm glad that you brought that up as well because in therapy we talk about confirmation bias, and so that
Good one too.
negativity is the confirming, like, oh well, this happened bad, so see, I'm a failure because I maybe didn't like say what I wanted to say well in this new job. But I like that you said that. Also the word that really highlighted for me was imposter. And
Yeah.
imposter syndrome, it's so serious, especially in an identity crisis and getting to the next step.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. And I think a lot of people go through imposter syndrome. And I've come to realize it really is just part of the process sometimes. Imposter syndrome is probably going to come up when you're doing a new thing. But I think it helps, even to just know that it's normal and natural to feel that way, I think helps eliminate some of the negative feelings that you're having associated with feeling like you are an imposter.
Absolutely. I think when you were saying that, I was thinking of like measuring tape, so to speak. And if you took that measuring tape up to your life, we tend to, I feel like we say, well, I didn't get to this place yet, so I'm not good enough for it. There's no way I can be, um, good at the next thing that I go into. And I think that's where a lot of it is. I think we think too much about measuring our lives, when it comes to your identity or where you think you need to be or where you think you should be by your age or your background or your relatives because they went so far. I feel like we measure ourselves so harshly.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially going back to what we were talking about earlier with the societal sort of expectations. I feel like there are milestones where people kind of expect you to have a career by this point and get married by this point and have a baby by this point. So yeah, absolutely. I think that yeah, there are sort of like, I guess, how would I describe that? Like milestones that people are expecting us to hit. And sometimes going against that too can feel quite scary.
Absolutely. And sometimes I feel like, you always will have people out there judging, but it's unfortunate that it's such a harsh judgment on that you need to be defined by a certain status quo when really, like, I think one of my favorite quotes that's out there is we're just walking each other home because eventually, we do pass. I know that's really dark right there, but I just always appreciated that quote because that's what we're doing. I don't know who thought we need to be this certain thing at this certain point when really we're just all trying to experience life.
Yeah, in our own unique ways on our own unique paths, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I know that we have talked about the identity crisis when it comes to career, and
Yes.
I do feel that there are so many different really places in life that we could talk about identity crisis. But one I did want to share is the medical recovery identity crisis. And as you know, recently I did have jaw surgery.
Yes.
But prior to jaw surgery, you also were on my journey with me as my coach, um, when I was processing myself before being a mother, getting myself prepared to be a mother. And I wanted to kind of dive in on both of those subjects, but maybe start with the medical on how, like, even just like a change of a physical aspect, um, or if like let's say you had something happen to you and you're recovering and so you're not able to perform certain things, like for example for me fitness was completely taken off the table for a little bit because you don't realize how many muscles are used with your face until you have jaw surgery. And I'm not saying that's the only time, but you just don't realize how many muscles are used. And so having to slow everything down, having to go back to like a whole new world that's you haven't touched in, I mean, like when it comes to the soft food diet, for example, going back to that, I think the last time I had a soft food diet was probably infancy, you know what I mean? Toddler stage.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and just trying to like figure out who am I and what is next for me? Like, I feel like even in the medical side of things, you have a sense of like almost the struggle of the person you were before to the person you are now. Um, you know?
Absolutely. I think that probably comes in a couple different forms. I think one
Yeah.
can be what you're describing, which is where there's actually some kind of physical alteration to your body, right? So for you, it was your jaw. Um, some people have things as severe as an amputation of their limb, right?
Yeah.
And imagine finding your new identity in the face of something like that.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
then there's also the side of it, I think, where people get a medical diagnosis, like you're diagnosed with cancer. What
Oh,
is that
yeah.
look like? What is the new identity there? So I think there's multiple layers to this and ways it can show up medically.
Absolutely. Yeah. I feel like, and these things though, like you couldn't really classify them under the midlife crisis that we're kind of always, it's always the big deal of people saying this midlife crisis happened, but it happens in everything. Like any big trauma or change, I feel like it makes you question yourself and be like, well, and sometimes you do go down the negative lane of like, well, why am I here? All the emotions that come with it. And I feel like it was so important to talk about these things today because I don't think we realize how often it happens and how it goes across the board.
Absolutely. It goes across the board. And I think one area can affect another area too.
Yeah.
Um, even with the medical example, say you have something medically happen to you where you physically just aren't capable of the same things, either
Yeah.
for short or long term, but then you have maybe like you have a child and you want to interact with your child and you want to be in this identity of a mom too, but you can't quite be the mom you want to be because you have these physical things impeding you. So I think they can start to overlap too, identity in these different areas of our lives and conflict with one another.
Absolutely. And I'm actually glad you brought that up because I do remember that it was a huge transition um where I did have to have family come in to help, because a lot of this was going to lie on my husband and they also had to take care of me as well. So it shifted the dynamic even in the family aspect where my husband was taking on more of my I don't want to say like only my roles, but the stuff that I did a part of our role as a family. And then, my father had to take on the role of being the caregiver for myself or my son, depending on who he was in charge of that day. And
Really?
then being in it and watching it, which I don't I can't say that's my favorite to ask for help, but even that person who didn't really like asking for help, being forced to ask for help because there is no other route in that time frame. Um, and then watching everything unfold and just being like, I can't, when he's crying, I can't pick him up, and it's a
Yeah.
huge. It was hard, and also I did a really bad thing. Prior to, well, around surgery time. So I was still breastfeeding at the time. And up to the point of surgery, I did not have it perfectly laid out on what was going to happen when it came to breastfeeding. Um, I was supposed to, like, I had weeks on, I had this plan, I was going to get it all prepared, and I just went in there like ill prepared, but I will say my family did come, they came in strong. Um, it did
Good.
work out, but in that moment, that feeling of like I failed my son and I'm failing myself because I didn't prepare. So a lot of things that, yeah, sorry, I
Yeah.
went on a little tangent there, but a lot really does come from one thing and then domino effect
Yeah.
after.
No, and it makes sense what you're saying because it sounds like, at least for a period of time, everything you were going through with your body and healing and what you could and couldn't do was affecting your identity as a mom and who you wanted to
Yeah.
be as a mom, right? How now that you're mostly recovered from your surgery at this point, right?
Yes, I'm in
Yeah.
a lot better place now.
So I'm curious now that you're more fully recovered, do you still feel like there's kind of an identity impact, or do you think it was more of a short-term thing?
So it's kind of funny that you say that because I do think for that moment, that identity is has definitely gotten better. And what I didn't realize is that when I finally could hold my son again, which it was a few weeks before I could, we did restart breastfeeding. So I thought I was never going to be able to go back to it. Now I will say today we're not as we've kind of fizzled out on it, but during that time, um, I didn't think I'd ever get to breastfeed again. I just had all these thoughts that happened. So I will say my identity shifted, but after I got to this place, I'm in a new identity crisis. And I don't want to say like it's how do I say this? It's not like it's a full-blown shift, but it's a change of the actual physical thing that happened with the jaw, where everyone has told me how beautiful I looked and how I looked before. And, they've told me that, um, they talk about how I've recovered and all these beautiful things, but the mind has not caught up to the actual change yet.
Yeah.
So it's a
Yeah.
new shifted identity crisis.
No, I think that's a really valid thing to talk about. And I mean, look, identity is not always going to be this world, like earth-shaking type of thing. I wouldn't describe my identity transitioning into that of a college teacher as anything that totally rocked my world either. But yeah, I'm sure that when your physical body changes in a pretty major way, that does shift your identity a bit and get you thinking about your physical identity differently. And I've heard that the same thing happens. With those who have undergone major weight loss. People who
Yes.
go and they lose like 50, 60, 70 pounds, they look in the mirror and they feel like they don't really recognize who they are for a while. It's a little bit jarring.
Yeah. That is, I have also heard that as well. And I definitely understand that feeling, um, today. I would say today because it is a present moment thing, and that's why we're here because it's like, oh, well, you're experiencing it or you've experienced it, and it just it's wild how in different ways it can come in, but also just I will say that the shift then when it came from, you know, identity with being a mom and having the surgery and not being able to take care of my son is definitely a different perspective. So I wouldn't say that my identity crisis in this time is anything really big, but it's still a different feeling and trying to get the mind to come to present mode with the look, and
Yeah.
what's come with it. And when I look at myself in photos, there are times I do not recognize me because it's not to say I changed so extravagantly where I'm not me, but there, in a sense, it kind of was huge for me because my teeth were my. I'm not saying I don't have any other insecurities. I obviously do, but my teeth were my biggest. I never ever thought in a million years I would be where I am today, where I had jaw surgery and we're in this place. So it's getting like trying to catch up to that big procedure that's happened, and it's hard to believe that we're gonna hit a year in February.
Wow. Yeah.
But I feel like I'm still in the beginning of like, wait, what just happened?
Yeah, you're still catching up, and that makes sense. I mean, I think with any new identity, it's your thoughts too, right? I think of identity as what thoughts am I thinking, who am I being, what action am I taking? So yeah, it makes sense that maybe the thought part of it sounds like hasn't quite caught up yet.
Yeah, it definitely hasn't. But I do want to ask you, going back to when you were in the professor position,
Yeah. Mhm.
um, how would you say like currently, how are you feeling in shifting from that to where you are today?
Oh, that's a really good question. I am a health coach. I also do some other entrepreneurial things. And I think that it's really interesting right now because I'm kind of playing with what does that look like?
Yeah,
Because I will say, I do health coaching, I do some tutoring, I support some other entrepreneurs. And it's so interesting because it's almost like a different identity for each. I
yeah,
mean, I'm still me, I'm who I am, and I have my same traits and my same values that I carry across all three. But it is interesting. And I think that honestly, that's something that comes up in life too of almost testing identities out and
yeah.
seeing, what feels natural, what is the thing that you kind of want to run with. And I think that sometimes, yeah, it's just a matter of almost experimenting with your identity and kind of determining the next step that way too.
I like that you said that because I feel like with my own position today, I feel like I am doing a little bit of that for myself as well, of trying to figure out, okay, you know, what do I like, who do I want to be? What is my purpose? Like for a while, I said this on the last podcast, I actually wasn't doing episodes because I felt embarrassed of the position that I was in. But it's so ironic because I say that the Brie Pod is about calling back your power, which is literally your identity. It's your
Yeah,
power.
absolutely. Yeah.
And so when you came through a message and reached out to me, and we weren't even talking about this, but you actually inspired me to do that last podcast.
Aw. Oh my gosh.
Oh, don't worry, don't worry. You inspired me to do that last podcast, and it was like, I think that I needed to be in this position of the raw, vulnerable, I don't know what's going to happen next in order to accept what, you brought to me. Because if I would have known exactly what I wanted and who I am in that moment, I don't, I wonder if I would have brought back the Brie Pod.
Yeah, I'm so glad. I'm so glad that it had that impact on you. Sorry for my barking dogs, by the
Oh,
way.
don't worry.
They're very
It's
cute,
life,
very loud.
natural life.
Yeah, it is around here. I can tell you that. Yeah, I'm so glad that it had that effect on you. And I think that I don't know if this is helpful to you or not, but one thing that I've learned is if there's something I genuinely want to do, which I know this podcast is very meaningful, something you're very passionate about, sometimes it's a matter of going back to the teaching and when I did that at Portland Community College of really leaning into the identity. And I think that sometimes people who are entrepreneurs in any area, whether you're a podcast host or a health coach or whatever else you do, sometimes people really stop themselves because they don't spend enough time taking on that identity. So,
Yeah.
really leaning in and going, okay, like if I am the podcast host, what am I going to do? What does that look like? What does that identity look like? And I don't know what that is for you specifically, but it could be like, committing to this many episodes a month or reaching out to this person that I've always wanted to reach out to have on my show or doing research every week about topics and about who I might like to bring on, whatever it is. But I think, yeah, for the things you're passionate about, it's so important to really lean into your identity and to start to adjust your thoughts and actions accordingly so you can see yourself as that successful entrepreneur in whatever area it is.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think that it's so true. Because I know that if I would have continued, um, not putting in, I shouldn't say like if I wouldn't have done anything about it or I wouldn't have had that little nudge, I think that I would be doing myself a disservice because this has become a part of my identity. My
Yeah.
voice is a part of my identity um and I feel like it's funny because when I started this podcast, I started because I was unable to have a child and it was my place to try to find myself in different ways. So, it was bringing in people to discuss different things that meant a lot to me and to bring calling back the power, whether it be financially or emotionally or physically or whatever it was. So we brought in all the coaches and everything. And it's just interesting looking back on all of it. Um, I do feel that had I had I not been through the many shifts of my identity, I don't know if this podcast would have happened. And so I am, even though I get scared and worried, and like we were talking about earlier, you have to lean into those feelings. I'm kind of glad, and I'm not saying I'm not saying of not being able to have a child. I'm talking about like the general sense.
Yeah.
I'm kind of glad that the scarcities from it were the things that kind of pushed me into learning more about myself and who I am. And I want to know how, for you, how, do you feel that as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. Even as you were talking, it sparked something in me that I've been thinking about recently where I've sort of been having these moments where I wish I was, like we were talking about earlier, further along with certain things in my life. But then I also have these moments where I'm reflecting and it's like, look, if I hadn't gone through all these other things that I had gone through, I would not be the person I am now. And the person who I am today is who I need to be to really make these things happen. So yeah, I absolutely go through that too. And, even though life is challenging and there are portions of my life that have felt challenging, as I know there's been for you too, ultimately I am so grateful because without all those experiences, I wouldn't be in the position I am now.
Absolutely. I agree with you on that. And it actually made me think of something. So we may circle for a second, but
Okay.
what you just remind me of is so back when I was having my son, prior to that, we had found out that I had endometriosis. And I've learned a lot from my experiences that there is a huge sense of medical gaslighting when it comes to the medical world and
Yes.
not just the medical world, it's in career too.
Yeah.
Um, but I bring this up because there was a time as a mom where I had just had my son and I've gone through medical gaslighting before. I was told with endometriosis, you're told so many things. But but for me, it was a new experience to have my son. I was never a parent before. I had been an aunt, but never a parent. And I didn't realize like there are so many things you had to go through when it comes to like discharge. And for me, I was discharged later because I had iron issues. But
Mm.
to fast forward, my son needed a pediatrician. And at the time, I'm shifting into a new identity as a mom, which is nerve-wracking. And, as many things that happen becoming a mom, your career kind of shifts a little bit. Even if you stay in a career or if you don't, it doesn't matter, but it's still like a shift or a change. And then on top of that, there's a shift and change of your role, like who who you are now to this little human being. And so I had to get him a pediatrician, and prior to this date, I had one. But anytime I mentioned the woman's name, nobody knew who she was. So it kind of freaked me out while I was in the hospital hearing this because they're like, once you're done here, you have to be your pediatrician. So fast forward, I get discharged. The day I get discharged happens to be the day that I have to bring my son to the pediatrician. I bring him there, and mind you, in the hospital, for any circumstances, if you have to stay overnight, sleeping is not a thing. It does not work out because they come in like every
I'm
hour to do
sure.
whatever it is. Yes,
Yeah.
it's a lot. So I was sleep deprived. I was in a new identity, going into a new identity, and I go into this office, and now the side of me that knows about medical gaslighting, the side of me that's been places that I know that's not okay for me, saw the red flags. Like just
Yeah.
going into the office, the vibe did not feel good. And I mean, I just kind of chalked it up as, oh, you're just really tired. You haven't slept in days. It's just, I had all these red flags that popped up, but I had an excuse for myself as to why. And anyway, as we're sitting there, she's asking all these questions that I don't really have answers right away to because, again, I just got out of the hospital. I am tired. I am new to this experience. And the first thing that she tells me, because there was a paper issue, because they didn't know who she was, even though she had been in the business for like 30 years, she hadn't received everything from the hospital yet. So she's going based off of what she saw. And from what she saw, she's like, you're starving your child.
Oh my gosh.
Now, mind you, I just stepped into this new role and I'm like, now I'm killing my son. Like, that was the first thought. I'm killing my son. Like, this is awful. And so I remember that I was sitting there and I kind of disassociated at this point because once I heard that, my brain just went in loops on all the ways I'm a bad person and how I should have been better. And so I am grateful that my husband took over the conversation for this because I did disassociate. And then all of a sudden, all of the feelings that I had, I was bawling, just sitting there bawling. And then she looked at me and she's like, why are you crying? And I'm like, uh, you just told me my son, you know what I mean? Like he's not being cared for properly. And then she also wanted me to take my shirt off right there in this cold office and breastfeed my son in this office. And I was like, no, 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 I need to go home. Um, so anyway, trying to get this story quicker. But the next day, I went to sleep. Now she had a time limit. She's like, you need to wake up your son after this amount of time. You need to feed him at this amount of time. Well, I decided that I need to sleep. And if my son was going to eat, he's going to let me know. And that's what I was told by many moms that I had spoke to that day, including my own mom, that it's okay, you can sleep. Your son will let you know. You're not starving him. I mean, I know that there's certain circumstances where you may have to add extra things, but in this circumstance, she didn't have all the evidence of what had happened at the hospital, so she didn't really know. So the next day, I had more sleep and I had a clear mind, and
Yeah.
I broke up with her because I remembered my
Ew.
medical gaslighting. Um, and the reason I brought this up is because had I not had that identity shift from going through, and I'm not saying I needed to go through all those things to get there, but had I not had that identity shift of trying to find out what was wrong with me in the get-go of endometriosis, I don't know if I would have had the strength that next day to be like, I actually don't need to go to this lady. I can change everything and to fill out the paperwork that I need to. It's going to be, even if it is time consuming, it's going to be better for my son than to go to someone that, made me feel that horrible.
Yeah, it sounds like what your history with the endo and everything gave you was the ability to feel more empowered in medical
Yeah.
situations, which, yeah, I mean, what a gift to have, honestly, because I think so many people do not feel empowered in
Yeah.
conversations with their doctor to speak up when they know something isn't right. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's another really good example of some really positive things that can come from identity shifts over time.
And speaking with identity shifts, I want to kind of pivot a little bit, but for you, like, how do we navigate this? Because now that we know, that we have this constantly. It's not just a midlife crisis. It's not like at 20, what did they say? The certain ages of when you're going to hit it. We hit
Yeah.
these shifts constantly. How do we navigate these shifts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious to hear what you think too, but I think part of it is maybe just talking about it like we are today. I think talking about it makes you realize that, it's normal that we all feel this way in a variety of areas of our life, whether it is career, whether it is stepping into motherhood or anything else. And, I think for me, again, in my experience, for me, what's been most helpful in navigating that is one, to identify, okay, what is wrong here and maybe what is that next identity I want to shift into. And then from there, after you identify that, it's just a matter of kind of leaning in and being really patient with yourself, knowing that when you make a big change, when you're leaning into a new identity, it's not always going to go perfectly. Going back to the example of when I shifted into teaching, I can assure you that that did not always go perfectly, that I made mistakes. But really, again, being willing to be with that discomfort and to gradually lean in and take those small steps until it gets to the point where it is really natural and it now is your identity.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think for one of the things that I was thinking when you were saying that is what I have found with navigating other shifts, because as we talked about, I am in a current identity shift right now. I think one of the ways that I had to work with, especially um, from endo to motherhood, I think is just to not put such a defined um, like definition of what I need to be. I think
Yes.
that is something that I had to let go of is the definition of like, well, I have to be, I have to always feel good as a mother. I have to always feel good um, on my hunt for my diagnosis. There were days that I fell backwards. There are days that I cry and I'm like, I feel like just feeling it has to happen. Like you said, we
Yeah.
have to feel it. We have to stop putting this unreachable bar that we know doesn't have to be reached within a certain time. I think we always assume that if I don't reach this bar at a certain time, I'm trash. And
So true.
I don't think that I think that's been one of the things I've tried to look at it. And so right now, for example, in the middle of this shift, I think the thing that I've been focusing on is what I can, which is like basically the basics. Is my
Yeah.
nutrition versus, because I do have to focus on my nutrition and just instead of worrying about, because one of the shifts too is that because I had surgery and because I didn't have fitness, I gained more weight. And for me, as you know, I did have trigger warning and eating
Yeah.
disorder prior to all this. Um, I feel like with all of those things, I just have had to tell myself we have to take it day by day and start with something small. And even the smallest step is a step.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that goes back to gradually leaning in over time. And I think what you're maybe not directly saying, but another thing that might be important too is that sometimes I think that there's a problem when it almost becomes an imbalance of identity, is the best way I can put it. So maybe if somebody has made their career their entire identity, right? Like you are the executive, you're answering emails at 11:30 every night because that is your identity. You're always stuck in that identity. Or even people who make being a mom, as beautiful as that is, their entire identity. Oftentimes, I think people end up feeling like something's off in that situation too. So I think also looking at maybe the unhealthy side of where you over identify in one area at the expense of taking care of yourself or other areas that are important to you as well.
I like that you said that because it's so true. You can't fill from an empty cup either. And I'm hoping within, my own life that my son will, I guess, learn that, I'm not always going to be I'm not always gonna be an amazing mom because you know how he looks at me. He's like, "Oh, you're beautiful." I don't think
Yeah.
I'm always
Well, you
gonna.
are, but
But I hope that he learns that, the shift. I'm hoping that for him as he grows up, that he can be, maybe he'll be able to learn a little bit more of the resilience to the shifting and that it's
yeah,
actually okay. Like sidestepping is okay. And I think for us and our generation, I do feel like we are and I'm not saying generations past aren't going through this because I'm sure they are as well today
yeah,
as too,
absolutely.
but like we are charting new territory. We are charting new waters that were not a norm 50, 60 years ago. We are starting to go in a new way. And I think that shifting is important. Being able to kind of like go with that. I'm not very good with words today, but I'm glad you're here to help me with it.
No, I know what you mean. Yeah, it's almost like he's going to grow up with you modeling the fact that it's okay to make a pivot in life, right?
Yes, pivots, yes.
Just because you start in one career, for example, doesn't mean you have to be locked in to that for the rest of your life if it's not something that brings you joy. And so I think that, yeah, what a beautiful gift to give him of modeling something different and just making it okay to make changes, to make pivots in life. My dog just jumped on my lap. I'm so
Oh, no, I love it.
monsters. They're so cute, but they're out of control.
That's okay. I love it. It's an animal friendly zone here. So
It's so funny too, because she almost never jumps on my lap, but now all of a sudden that I'm doing something recorded and important, you
oh,
just need to join, huh?
I think she just knows that we need that comfort level. It's a
Yes,
safe
yeah,
space.
yeah. She
Like
feels comfortable, huh?
yeah, no, this is good. I love having her, so I think she's the perfect um like I don't want to say ending because I feel like, we'll definitely have more conversations here, but
Would
a
love to.
perfect like it's okay. We are presently in this moment together.
Yes, yes. Her present is, hey, just slow down and pet me. I just want some attention. But yeah, absolutely. It's been such a good conversation, and I would be honored to come back on anytime and talk about it some more. So let me know.
Yes. Oh, well, you'll definitely come back. You're gonna be a regular. You came back before, you come back again.
I love it. Yeah, we'll get to the point where I'm like a five-time repeat guest.
Yes. There's nothing wrong with that.
No, I love it. And thank you so much again for having me.
Thank you so much, Katie. And I just want to say to the listeners and viewers, you are loved, you are worthy, you are cherished, and we are proud of you. Until next time on the Brie Pod. Bye.